I'm going to pivot here and introduce our speaker. Many of you know who he is. In many ways, Jeh Johnson is uniquely situated to launch our series of discussions this week about this most important election. As Homeland Security Secretary during the Obama administration, Jeh Johnson first designated the election system as part of the nation's critical infrastructure, deserving of all the protections the government now offers through the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. Weeks before that designation, if I'm not wrong, the Secretary and Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, in a rare joint public statement, declared that Russia was behind efforts to interfere in the 2016 election. As Secretary Johnson's portfolio also included oversight of the U.S. Secret Service, now at the center of a familiar firestorm for the failings in the attack on former President Trump. All of that is to say that Secretary Johnson, a former federal prosecutor, a former general counsel at the Defense Department, knows a little bit about what we'll be discussing this week and what this election means for our democracy. The Secretary, I reminded him earlier today that my last interview with him at DHS was on the morning of October 28, 2016, when after emerging from a secure room that prohibited all cell phones and electronics, we learned that then FBI Director Comey had reopened the Clinton email investigation just days before the November election. I remember turning to Secretary Johnson that morning, who said simply, "Here we go." So with that, please welcome Jeh Johnson. Here we go.
Thank you, Kevin. Is this mic on? Everyone hear me? Kevin, thank you for that introduction. That was not simply what we gave you in my bio. You remind me with those issues of something I once heard Barack Obama say: this stuff would be really interesting if I wasn't caught in the middle of it. Today I am going to exercise my free speech rights, and as I once heard my late law partner, Ted Sorensen, JFK's speechwriter, say, and that's what you are getting, a free speech. And I feel obliged these days, when I give a set of remarks or a speech, to make a disclaimer. No part of this speech was written by generative AI. I did it all myself, so you can blame me. It's an election year. I'm a Democrat, but today I do not speak to you as a partisan Democrat. I speak to you as a partisan American. I am a former government servant. Today I am a private citizen. So today, and this is, I think, the first time in my career, in my life, I think I've ever spoken to a collective audience of just reporters. But I speak to you in many different capacities. As a consumer of what you create, as a former newsmaker, as an interviewee, a frequent public commentator on national and world events, as a TV junkie, and so forth. I have to say, I've had, with some small exceptions, a good experience dealing with the press. For the most part, reporters have been my friends, and been able to respect each other's relative boundaries and perspectives and work. In my post-government life, it is, for me, nice to be able to be a commentator about matters for which I have no responsibility anymore. It does always seem easier with a little bit of with a little bit of distance. So I wanted to just share with you some of the places you may have Network Morning News. I think this one was during COVID. Morning Joe, MSNBC. That's Morning Joe. More Morning Joe. But the interesting thing about Morning Joe, by the way, it is truly a kitchen table conversation. I don't know what we're going to talk about when I show up. I think I know what we're going to talk about when I show up, but the conversation could roam into a book review, and the book is put in front of me, and we're going to review the book. I haven't read the book. But it's truly a kitchen table conversation on Morning Joe. The CNN Morning Show with Phil Mattingly and Poppy Harlow before it got canceled. More CNN Morning Show, more CNN Morning Show, more CNN Morning Show. Face the Nation, the Sunday morning shows. By the way, the White House, certainly in Democratic administrations, makes a big deal of who goes on the Sunday morning shows because everybody in Washington is watching the Sunday morning shows. So more than any other network show or any other cable news show during the week, the White House always cares intensely about who goes on Sunday morning news shows to have sort of a coordinated attack at it. So Face the Nation, Meet the Press. I'm a semi-regular on Meet the Press, insights and analysis about maybe once every 2 to 3 months. That's late. The ABC Sunday Morning News Show. That is from the attic of a B&B I was staying in upstate New York right after a mass shooting. And CNN, Fareed Zakaria, MSNBC, when Jonathan Capehart was doing the Sunday morning news shows for MSNBC. That is my den in my home in Montclair, New Jersey. Room Raider. Everybody here knows about Room Raider, right? Room Raider, I got as high as an 8 with this background. They take off points if there are any cords exposed. I got a perfect 10 once for my office. Now, this appearance in, I think, September of 2020. I was so excited that Face the Nation wanted to do the interview with a camera crew in my backyard in Montclair, New Jersey, so I could show off my garden, which I did. And all was going well. We were talking about election security in September of 2020, in the run-up to the 2020 election. Everything was going fine until he showed up, Rooney, our rescue dog. And I am certain, I had no idea Rooney was behind me. And I am certain that every person watching Face the Nation that morning, the moment the dog roamed in the background, was no longer paying any attention to me because they were waiting to see whether or not he was going to lift his patch of grass in the backyard. When the interview was over, Margaret Brennan said to me off the air, what kind of dog was that? I said, what are you talking about? The dog that was wandering around in the backyard. I go, oh my God. So anyway, Rooney was very upset and apologetic for that. And he was, he never quite got over it. Anyway. So CNN, News, Situation Room, Wolf Blitzer. Nice thing about Wolf Blitzer is CNN will send a truck to my driveway. So all I literally have to do is put on this jacket and a pair of jeans, shirt and tie, and walk out my back door into the truck, and Wolf Blitzer interviews me. CNN makes it easy. This is Rachel Maddow, of course. There's my Room Raider number 9. Anderson 360, CNN Evening Show. My favorite, Andrea Mitchell. I'll come back to her. Andrea Mitchell's show, MSNBC at noon. I do local news once in a while. My favorite local news in New York is Good Day New York, Rosanna Scotto. Rosanna has been the co-host of Good Day New York for decades. And I once asked Rosanna, you've been a co-host of the same TV news show for decades. What's the key? And she said something very interesting. She said, I have to always come up with new ideas. I have to always keep digging. I have to always build new relationships, never rest on my laurels. That's been the key for her since I think the 1980s. And local news, I've learned this from her. Local news, local TV news is fundamentally different from cable news, national news, because viewers tend to watch local news in like 10-minute cycles. So every 10 minutes, you get traffic and weather, traffic and weather, traffic and weather. And very often they will replay an interview several times in the course of 3 hours. And I believe very strongly that I should work literally both sides of the street on 6th Avenue. So I'm on MSNBC a lot, more than any other network, but I also do Fox and Friends. I also do Fox, because what's the point of simply talking to people who are already going to agree with you or in their echo chamber? So I go on Fox. I go on Fox and Friends once in a while, or Neil Cavuto, typically when I have something I want to say to the Fox audience, to challenge them a little bit, not direct confrontation, but to challenge them a little bit on issues, say, of gun safety, or the latest crazy thing Trump said, to challenge them a little bit. And every once in a while, I'll say something that the Fox audience likes, which I didn't necessarily intend to say, but every once in a while, I'll get some interesting feedback from things I say, like this. Interestingly, after a Fox and Friends appearance, I get the most interesting emails. My email's public. If anybody ever wants to reach out to me, my email's public. And I get actually the most complimentary emails from after a Fox and Friends appearance. Some of it is vile and offensive. You Democrat, you're all the same, crawl back under your rock. And others are very complimentary. It's an interesting experience. This is last week on Anderson 360 about the Secret Service. And this is last week on Fox and Friends about the Secret Service. I think this was last Wednesday or Thursday. I dared wear a tan suit, talking about, didn't work too well with that yellow background, talking about a serious issue like this. But I'm a private citizen now, so I can do what I want. I didn't dare wear that suit when I was in office. And last but not least, I am also a radio host. It's one of my hobbies. I am a radio host on WBGO, Public Radio, Newark, New Jersey, 88.3 FM, for those still left who own a radio. I'm a huge classic R&B fan. I've been a huge supporter of this radio station in Newark, New Jersey, near where I live, for years. I've been a contributor financially. I've been on their board of directors. I'm a huge R&B fan. And a couple years ago, the station manager said, how would you like to have your own radio show? It's public radio. You can do almost anything, right? And I said, that'd be like fantasy camp for me. And so Saturday mornings, once a month, you can hear the radio show on WBGO, All Things Soul with Jeh Johnson, 88.3 FM, or WBGO.org. And I have a great time. I play my favorite classic R&B, Four Tops, Gladys Knight, Aretha, OJ's, 60s, 70s music, some 80s. And I have one interview per show. And my first interview in March 22, my debut show, I started off big with a saxophonist from Arkansas named Bill Clinton. And we had a great time. I only wanted 15 minutes of the president's time. He gave me 37 minutes. It was right after Russia invaded Ukraine. It was a great discussion. So anyway, out of all of this, and I also will do print. Out of all of this, I'd like to offer some observations. You can take that down. Some observations and suggestions, and from my perspective, as a former newsmaker, as a frequent commentator, as a frequent interviewee on TV and radio, NPR, and in print media. When I go on, say, a cable news interview, the first question I always ask is, how long am I on? Because that enables me to pace myself in the conversation. 6 minutes or less is not a real conversation. It's like 3 questions. And I always bring to the interview 3 or 4 talking points of what it is I'm going to say to get across to the audience, no matter what I'm asked. Because if it's 5, 6 minutes, there's no opportunity for follow-up. Like, what did you mean when you said, let me try that question again. You didn't really answer my question. There's no opportunity for that. So I bring 3 talking points or 4 talking points. If it's as long as, say, 9 minutes, oh, you're going to be on for 9 minutes. That's a real conversation where there's opportunity for follow-up, back and forth. I might get in 4 or 5 answers to questions, but for the interviewee who's not accustomed to TV every day, that 6 to 9 minutes always flies by in an instant. You feel like you're just getting warmed up. I always walk into an interview with a clear sense of what it is I want to say. The 3 or 4 things I know I want to say about the Secret Service or about the latest cyber attack or the presidential campaign or what I think of a particular candidate. For print media, at the beginning of an interview with a reporter, I always ask, what is your understanding of off the record? Or what is your understanding of deep background? Because very often I get different answers. My view is there are several different levels of off the record. One is you can quote me, but not by name. Or what I say to you can inform your journalism without quoting me by name, or we never talked at all. Or you can say a former Obama administration official said X. Now, and then there's a discussion about how to describe me without identifying me by name. And there's delicacy in that, because very often, depending upon the quote, you can figure out exactly who the former Obama administration official is, or former senior Obama administration official, or some people will recognize that's Jeh Johnson's voice, so it has to be him. And so, what I really dislike is when and I know a few that do this, when a reporter will lure me into an off-the-record conversation or a deep background conversation. And then as he's writing the story, he'll say, that was a really nice quote you gave me. Can't I quote you on the record? I said, no, because when I spoke to you, I was speaking to you off the record. Had I known you were going to put me in that position, I would not have even spoken to you. So I really don't, very few reporters do that, try to do that. And to me, that's just not good etiquette. I typically begin every conversation with a reporter by asking for this clarification. What is deep background? What is off the record? Because I think there are different understandings of that, and it's good to have that right up front. Where I've seen interviewees run into problems is where they try to have some of it on the record and some of it off the record. Because those of us who are relatively sophisticated consumers and readers know, we tend to believe, okay, this person was quoted on the record by name in one part of the story, and somebody else is quoted anonymously off the record. They're probably the same person. So at least we assume that. So where interviewees run into trouble is there's not a clear understanding, and you try to switch the off the record on and on throughout the interview, and it gets really confusing. So I tend to begin every print interview, almost every these days, with, unless we agree otherwise, everything I say to you is on the record and for attribution. Go ahead. Have that clarification right up front. One thing that I don't respond well to is when I get an an email overture from a reporter, a print reporter, including from some very, very reputable news organizations. And you can tell the email is sort of a mass email hunting for a story, hunting for an interview. Begins with, "Hi there, I'm working on a story about so-and-so and so-and-so." And one time I got really angry with the reporter, and I probably shouldn't have. I apologized later. I said, "Hi there is not the appropriate way to open a conversation with a former cabinet official. Why don't you try again?" And it was the young reporter's way of just trying to check a lot of boxes with a lot of people for whom he or she had email addresses for. And it's not a good way to build a relationship with a news source. It really isn't. To me, the ultimate professional in your space is Andrea Mitchell. She is probably dean of the Washington Press Corps. She's been a reporter for over 50 years. Andrea probably reports about 10% of what she knows. And you can always trust her. She spends a lot of time cultivating relationships with people in Washington. She works as hard as anyone, even though she's 78 years old. She works as hard, if not harder, than any reporter I know. She's always working. She's always thinking about the issues. And she cultivates relationships. So you can sit down with her for lunch and just gossip. And you don't have to say, "That's off the record," right? That's off the record. I mean, she knows, presumptively, that if you want to maintain her relationships in Washington, which is a small town, you can't burn people. And to me, that's the gift of a good reporter, whether you're on a national scale, inside the Beltway, a local news reporter, just building and cultivating relationships with people to earn their trust. Most public officials are suspicious of reporters, are suspicious of the press. They don't know how to deal with you. They're afraid of you. I have found that if I trust you and you trust me, we can work effectively together to serve each other's interest. Now, I would like to say something in some prepared remarks that happen to fit this very discussion we've been having. This is very similar to what I intend to say at a convention of the American Bar Association on Friday on the subject of democracy, the state of our democracy. Judge Michael Luttig and I have been co-chairing a task force, an ABA task force, about over the last year on how to save our democracy, how to strengthen and save our democracy. Our task force is 29 distinguished Americans, mostly but not exclusively lawyers by any means. For example, Judy Woodruff is a member of our task force. Bill Kristol is a member of our task force. Richard Haas, retired judges, commentators, historians. It was a remarkable group. And this is something like what I intend to say on Friday at the ABA convention with the rollout of our report. Our American democracy and the rule of law are under serious threat, stoked by false and irresponsible political rhetoric. Polls indicate an alarming number of Americans today distrust our democracy. More than 1/3 of Americans indulge in the erroneous belief that the 2020 election was stolen. In fact, despite the challenges of COVID, numerous audits, recounts, and lawsuits, and a record 158.4 million Americans who voted, the 2020 presidential election was probably the most transparent and secure in the nation's history. Over 60 court rulings across the country issued by judges, Republicans and Democrats alike, challenging the 2020 election, revealed no fraud or other material irregularities. There is no court ruling to the contrary. Further, Among Americans, there appears to be a rising, dangerous, and naive fascination with alternative authoritarian forms of government. Leading the way are certain American political leaders who openly express adulation for anti-democratic foreign leaders such as Hungary's Viktor Orban and Russia's Vladimir Putin. According to a recent poll, approximately 38% of Americans support authoritarianism as a response to the direction of our democracy here in the United States, and less than 1/3 of millennials consider it essential to live in a democracy. Finally, polls indicate an alarming percentage of Americans in the range of 25%, who say violence is justified if their candidate for office is not elected. Professor Robert Pape of the University of Chicago has been a leader in this research, and I refer you to his work. Political rhetoric condoning or suggesting violence is escalating and becoming mainstream, while actual political violence is also on the rise. This should not be regarded as coincidence. As I've said many times over years, those who, with a public voice, who engage in irresponsible, overheated rhetoric make previously unacceptable behavior acceptable, and for the dangerous few among us, violence inevitable. As a boy in the 1960s, the largest and all too common word in my lexicon was the word assassination. Within a 5-year period, 5 national leaders were assassinated: Medgar, Malcolm, Martin, Bobby, and Jack. Any American my age, like me and Kevin, will recall the top 10 hit song, Abraham, Martin, and John. Released in 1968, it seems the good die young. I just looked around and then they were gone. Due in large part to the hard work and vigilance of the Secret Service. Yes, I'm going to say a good word about the Secret Service. I was their oversight. I was also one of their protectees. Prior to July 13th, it had been 43 years since anyone took a shot at a president, a former president, or a candidate for president. The targets of political violence in America are bipartisan, both Republicans and Democrats. It touches all branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. As of 2022, threats against members of Congress were 10 times higher than they were just 5 years before. Since the 2020 election, threats and harassment directed at election workers have risen dramatically. A Reuters study published in August of 23 revealed then 213 incidents of political violence in this country since January 2021, and an overall high level in political violence not seen since the 1970s. This culminated, of course, in the acts of July 13th, 2024, when a gunman shot and nearly killed former President Trump at the rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. The political violence that erupted on January 6, 2021, pushed our democracy close to the breaking point. The United States can no longer boast that every 4 to 8 years we have a peaceful transfer of power. There were related plots to subvert the 2020 presidential election at the state level, resulting in state-level criminal prosecutions in Georgia, here in Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin, and Arizona. The virtues of democracy should be self-evident to any American, but if polls are believed, for many they are not. Thus, the question must then be asked and answered: why democracy? The hallmarks of a true democracy are freedom of speech, dissent, assembly, religion, the press, and government by the consent of the governed. And every few years, if the governed are dissatisfied with those who govern them, they get to throw the bums out in the next election. In an autocracy, these freedoms are suppressed. As I mentioned, in August 23, the president of the American Bar Association appointed me and Judge Michael Luddig to lead an ABA task force on democracy. Over the past year, we've engaged in a variety of nationwide activities to educate, motivate, and support the work of lawyers, public officials, and election officials in the run-up to the 2024 election. Later this week at the convention in Chicago of the ABA, we will issue a call to action for the nation's 1.3 million lawyers, what lawyers can and need to do to preserve, protect, and defend our democracy. Today in this room, I'd like to make the same plea to you. In my humble opinion, members of the press have a special and unique opportunity, and I would say obligation, to help protect our democracy. Much of our problems lie with false, irresponsible, and overheated political rhetoric that ricochets across social media in an instant. But the problems can't all be blamed on social media, X, and Elon Musk. More conventional media is, in my view, part of the problem and part of the solution. When I was in office as Secretary of Homeland Security, I'd get my daily intel briefing, classified information in a skiff. I'd go through the presidential daily brief, the classified information and news summaries that my staff had collected for me. And if I had time left over, I would read newspapers and Politico. If I had time left over, and the New York Post, but only if I had time left over, because by the time I had finished my classified briefing, I knew what I needed to know in office. Now I'm a private citizen. I rely on you. Like a public utility delivers our gas, our water, and our electricity, you deliver our news. What you bring to me forms the basis of my thoughts about the war in Gaza, the economy, the current presidential campaign, the Olympics, my New York Mets, and whether to leave the house with an umbrella and whether to take the car, the train, or the bus to work each day. So my pleas to you are these. Always tell the truth, the whole truth. There are no alternate universes. Fact check over and over again. Don't simply accept what some other reporter or journalist has said. The line I am most quoted for over and over again over the last 5 years is Jeh Johnson says that crossings on the southern border of more than 1,000 a day is a crisis. But Jeh Johnson never said that. What I actually said in an MSNBC Morning Joe appearance in March 2019 was that for me, when I was in office, a good day was anything under 1,000 crossings on the southern border, and a bad day was anything over 1,000 on the southern border. 1,000 a day overwhelms the system. I have no idea what 4,000 a day looks like. That's a crisis. That's what I said. But some sloppy reporter said, Jeh Johnson says that anything over 1,000 a day is a crisis. And it got repeated by other reporters who didn't bother to do the work to fact check. They just repeated what some reporters said. That Fox and Friends appearance last week, being interviewed by Steve Doocy, he kept referring to the vice president as the border czar, the border czar, the border czar. And I finally said, wait a minute. Republicans gave her the title border czar. You will find no White House document appointing her to be the border czar. To the extent anyone is a border czar in the executive branch, it is the Secretary of Homeland Security, which started a whole conversation. Yeah, who said she was the border czar? Someone had to finally stop and say, wait, hold on. The press keeps calling her a border czar. She's not the border czar. She's not appointed that. It's like saying I was the Secretary of Agriculture, and it gets repeated over and over again. Please bring us, thank you, please bring us a new mic. Please bring us competing, that's much better, thank you. I hope you all heard me in the back. Please bring us competing points of view. As citizens and participants in our democracy, we are stronger when exposed to the smart debate and exchange of ideas that test our own biases, prejudices, and assumptions. There are fewer and fewer places to go for that. Just imagine how much smarter we would be as American citizens if every day or every night we got to hear an exchange between a very smart conservative and a very smart progressive on a particular issue. Just imagine how much better informed and smarter we would be if that could happen. Don't allow us to live in our own narrow-minded silos. An example in a different context, satellite radio. I love satellite radio. I subscribe to satellite radio. Many of you probably subscribe to satellite radio. When I was growing up as a boy, all I listened to in the New York City area was 770 AM WABC radio, music radio. And ABC Music Radio played the top 10 hits several times an hour, no matter who the top 10 was, ranging from Smokey Robinson to Johnny Cash to Rod Stewart to the Temptations, the OJs, no matter whether it was country, R&B, pop, and that's how my ear for music was formed. So I prefer classic R&B, but I'll also like a good Johnny Cash song, I suppose, because I heard it when I was growing up. Now, satellite radio, there are narrow bands of taste in music. I find Channel 48, the classic R&B channel, and I stick with it. And I never go anyplace else because I'm listening to what I like. So it's like walking into the 7-Eleven, and am I going to pick my favorite Hostess Twinkie, or am I going to go for something different? And so don't allow us to live in our own silos. Try to expose your readers, your consumers, your viewers to a broader range of perspectives. We must never take for granted the virtues of living in a democracy. Everything I've said to you is, for you, I know, hard, because it is not necessarily good for ratings. It is not necessarily good for earnings per share. It is hard, but in my view, reporters, members of the press, journalists have a special obligation to our society. We depend on you to inform us about what to do. Those of us, meaning you and me, with a public voice, as a newsmaker, a commentator, or a news reporter, must assume the responsibility of preserving our democracy. Thanks for listening. Q&A?
Your job is only half done?
Yes, Q&A,
So
no
we're
problem.
going to go to Q&A.
Yes. I'll answer any question on the record, and if I don't want to answer it, I won't answer it.
Yeah, I look at it real.
Well,
Secretary Johnson, A.G. Gankarski, Florida Politics. I wanted to ask a follow-up regarding the border czar.
Yes.
In that narrative was pushed by Republicans for 3 years at least. Why was it necessary just in recent days to counter it, given that it was a fallacy and, once Harris was a presidential candidate?
Because she's a presidential candidate, that's why.
But why not correct it before? Why not correct it in 22 or 23 when you're on Fox and Friends?
Because I wasn't confronted with the title when I was in an interview on Fox and Friends until last week. And now, I'm sure the phrase border czar has appeared across news organizations only since she became the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. And so it just hasn't been a top of mind issue. But until it dawned on me when Steve Doocy kept saying border czar, border czar, border czar, say, wait a minute, she was not appointed the border czar. Basically what she was appointed to do is what Joe Biden undertook to do when he was vice president during the Obama years, which is develop the diplomatic relationship with Central America and try to work that to address the root causes in that part of the world and address issues of their economy, migration, and so forth.
Follow up also, were there talking points regarding the border czar question? Because some Republicans said there were. I think the Congressional Hispanic Caucus PAC may have had something like that. You didn't see anything like that, did you?
But the point is, when you work in the executive branch and you carry a title, there should be a document someplace saying you are hereby appointed to be ambassador to India. You're hereby appointed to be the special assistant to the president for X. The term border czar just got created, but it certainly didn't get created by the Biden administration. We had an Ebola czar, and that was Ron Klain during the Obama years. And the title was kind of accepted, but I mean, it wasn't a formal designation. Only the skeptics use that term to try to enlarge the responsibilities that she actually had.
Thank you.
Hi, Secretary Johnson. So in 2020, the administration spun up a huge sort of war room in Fort Meade with the FBI, DHS, and NSA all working together to combat election misinformation. And when apparently they're doing a similar, although they're being much more low-key about it this time around. But when I think about that, I'm reminded of the British government's belief that Singapore in World War II was impregnable because they had these huge 16-inch guns. But the guns were all pointed outwards and they couldn't be moved. Aren't we in that same situation? That all of this work is being done to deal with what is actually a tiny fraction, and I mean, I'm not convinced personally of its effectiveness, a tiny fraction of the misinformation problem, which is that coming from overseas, whereas the real problem, the call is coming from inside the house. What can the government do? Because everything it's tried to, it seems to me, over the past few years, has kind of, I mean, much of it appears to have backfired in one way or another.
Yep. So I'm going to give you a somewhat long answer. In 2016, in the fall of 2016, when we were facing Russian disinformation, I was in the Russian effort to try to put its thumb on the scale of our election. I, as Secretary of Homeland Security, was most concerned about a cyber attack on our election infrastructure that would alter votes, that would shut down reporting of election results somehow. That's what I was most focused on, somewhat focused on a cyber attack that would, like what happened to John Podesta, that would leak private emails into the public domain, which actually happened to him. Frankly, less focused on how the Russians had infiltrated our American conversation on social media. That was sort of the Trojan horse. And we only now, through the Mueller investigation and otherwise, fully understand the extent to which the Russians, posing as somebody other than Russian, infiltrated our American conversation about the presidential contest. And that brings me to, I think, the point you were getting at, which is what role, if any, should the government have in trying to identify, discourage, prevent disinformation? My answer to that is probably not at all, because the government does not, should not be involved in regulating speech. And there's a danger if you start down that road as a government. We should not be calling balls, and the government, in my opinion, and especially national security organizations, should not be in the business of calling balls and strikes. That's for you all, not for people like me, in a society that prides itself on free speech. And anytime people raise that idea, or an idea similar to it, I have to ask, how would such authority, if given to the government, be used in the hands of someone who does not respect constitutional norms? So let me be even more blunt. How would Donald Trump use the authority to regulate something he deems to be fake news. And so we have to always be careful in not treading too far in one direction to deal with the crisis of the moment. I hope I've answered your question. I mean, I have to say, I can't tell you how surreal it was for us to be, and Kevin alluded to this, how surreal it was for us in the Situation Room in the White House to be talking about the 2016 election at all. We're talking about a political event in the Situation Room of the White House. That was totally surreal. But it was confronting us. It was an unprecedented crisis, and we struggled with what to do, what to say, when to say it. And finally, Jim Clapper, the DNI, and I said, we're going to issue a statement. We'll issue it under our names, calling out what the Russians are doing so that Americans would be armed with that information about how the Russians were trying to put their thumb on the scale. Because before that, there was a lot of speculation, but the government itself had not made an official statement to that effect. And we issued that statement on October 7th, 2016, in the afternoon. A lot happened on Friday, October 7th, 2016. There were the leaked John Podesta emails. There was a hurricane, Hurricane Matthew, working its way up the coast of Florida. And then there was this little thing called the Access Hollywood video that got leaked the same day. And we issued our statement on October 7th, 2016. And I thought, naively, that a statement from the US government that a foreign government was trying to put its thumb on the scale of our election would be big news. Guess what? It was below the fold. In the Times and the Post, it was below the fold news. Everyone went chasing after sex, lust, and the Access Hollywood video. Oh, he's going to drop out now. He's got to drop out now. And it was only later, after the election, that reporters came back to, hey, didn't you say something about the Russians and the... Yes, I did. And the reason I know it was below the fold in the minds of reporters is I don't think there was, except maybe with the possibility of Charlie Savage of the New York Times, and somebody in this room could correct me if I'm wrong, I don't recall a single follow-up from a reporter. Tell us more. What do you mean? What did you mean in that page and a half statement? Everyone was focused on the other stuff. And so I say that because, we're all guilty of going after the more sensational stuff in the moment. Anyway.
Secretary Johnson, thanks for doing this. I'm Josh Meyer from USA Today. I think we did try to follow up on that with your staff, but they told us they didn't have any more information to give us. It was all classified.
We had more information.
I know, but you wouldn't tell us that. But anyway, so I'm going to resist the urge to do a Washington.
But do you agree with do you agree with my assessment?
I do. Yeah. So there's a million questions I could ask you. One but I'll just stick with one. So you were saying you don't want to call balls and strikes when it comes to social media and things like that, but you also said that the Russians were trying to infiltrate and sway our conversations.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts on this election Elon Musk has already officially come out for Trump. I know some people in the intelligence
Which he has the right to do, I
Right.
suppose.
Well, but does he though? That's the question. He says he has free speech and I have free speech, but when I post something on Twitter, not that I have an opinion or would share it with anybody.
Yeah, but are you the richest man in the world?
No, but I'm saying is when he posts something, he can engineer the algorithms so everybody sees his tweet. So he is putting his thumb. It's not just free speech. It's, there's a lot of complex issues at hand. So what would you do if you were in government right now when it comes to Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and all of those, and people like Elon Musk, in terms of regulation and investigations?
I think that efforts to, have you heard of NewsGuard?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what you think of NewsGuard, but I think the concept of a news guard where a news outlet gets a grade, a good housekeeping seal of approval, red, green, yellow, to arm people when you go to read something. Oh, wait a minute, this has a yellow flag. Maybe I should look for the green flags instead. I think that as a private endeavor should be encouraged. I think that certainly foreign nationals are not allowed to participate in American elections. They're not allowed to contribute to U.S. political campaigns. So, a foreign actor masquerading as someone else, I believe can be criminally sanctioned on the internet. But trying to, in some way, regulate it, discourage it, call it false or true or false by the government, by any government agency, is a bad idea. I don't think we can go down that road. I think it has to be up to the better angels of people in this room to take that responsibility on. In a nation with a constitutionally guaranteed freedom of the press, freedom of speech, I don't think that's the business of the government. There's a craving that we do more somehow. But government can and should only do so much.
Right. So what would you say are election security issues that we, maybe reporters in this room, or reporters generally sort of overlook? We've talked about disinformation. Yep. I know that Pennsylvania just launched an election security hotline for election workers and voters who've experienced physical threats. But what are other issues that we should be looking at as well?
So, the way our election system works in this country, the election, because of the Electoral College, the election will be decided in a few election districts in 6 states, including this one. And therefore, turnout matters in each of these 6 states. Who gets their voters out? And I didn't go into detail about this when I was in office, and I hesitate to do so here, but I believe an election result in this country, a national election result, dances on the head of a pin, because there are ways one could, and not just through cybersecurity, there are ways someone could suppress voter turnout in a particular precinct, in a particular neighborhood, by putting out fake information, by other conventional ways. Way before there was an internet, there are ways to suppress turnout in key precincts. And as we have elections that are closer and closer, decided in a few states. This election is going to be decided in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, maybe Arizona, maybe North Carolina, maybe Virginia, but it's going to come down to 5 or 6 states. And voters like me who live in New Jersey, we're irrelevant to that process. Anybody in California is irrelevant to that process, or New York. And so there are just, 50 communities where the next president is selected. And when you focus in on that, you can focus in on all of the weak spots that exist in the way we elect people.
Is Georgia one of those states?
I think Georgia, with Kamala Harris on the ballot, I think Georgia may have gotten pushed into the swing state category. Yes. I think, my personal opinion is the reason Biden won Georgia was because Raphael Warnock was on the ballot with him. That's my opinion. I could be wrong.
Secretary Johnson, great to meet you. My name's Dan Cooney. I'm with the PBS NewsHour. 2 questions for you. I'm going to ask a Washington question here. If you're asked by a future president to serve in their administration, would you consider it? Would you serve in their administration? And my second one is, in the news, in the last few years has been the rise of TikTok as a social media platform.
Yep.
I remember the CIA director telling Judy Woodruff in an interview, I think it was a couple of years ago, I would be very wary of TikTok and, posting anything there. The campaigns have used it. In your position as Homeland Security Secretary, I'm curious, like, with that background, is TikTok still a concern? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
First question first. Never say never, but I'm kind of done with government service. I really enjoy being in private life. And I can do things like this and say what I want. I don't have to be on anybody's talking points. By the way, talking points make an individual sound less intelligent, in my opinion. You can always tell when somebody's on their talking points. They make you sound less intelligent, It's not, you're just spitting out what somebody else, what some 28-year-old White House staffer told you to say. And the higher up in government you go, the fewer jobs left there are that I would take. So not counting on it, not looking forward to it or hoping for it or counting on it. TikTok. So I thought about that question as if I were a member of Congress when the legislation was working its way through Congress. Anytime there's a bipartisan stampede towards something, I always wonder, and there are only a handful of members who are willing to raise their hand and say, wait, hold on, slow down. I always want to stop and pay attention to what those few dissenters are saying against the political stampede. I mean, the reality is a whole lot of Americans rely on TikTok, and I would, if I still had access to classified information, I'd want to know the extent to which TikTok is government controlled by the Chinese government. To what extent is it or is it not? And to what extent can the Chinese government in some way invade what TikTok says, does? I'd want to know the extent to which they can actually have the ability to do that in a classified setting before I'd form my opinion on that. I know what I don't know now. So, I mean, I read public commentary about what you all write, but I know what I don't know.
Hi, Secretary Johnson. Lionel Ramos, cover state government for KOSU in Oklahoma City for NPR's member station there. On the topic of talking points,
Yes.
I want to hear your thoughts on reporting what elected officials do versus what they say. And as someone who's probably, definitely been on talking points and had to choose whether or not that's what you wanted to say and whether or not that was, in fact, what you were going to say. We have Ryan Walters in our state who, says kind of in all of his press releases and everything that he follows the Bible, this and that. Most Oklahomans agree with him. That's the basis for his policy. And then he turns around and mandates that the Bible be taught in every classroom in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Which is a different stake. The stakes, at least in my mind, and I would assume in the minds of most of us here, go way up at that point. Mm-hmm. And so we have to discern, acknowledging who lives in Oklahoma and the things that they believe in mass and in majority and the way that the people in Oklahoma are, right? And also balance the way that they live with what they find to be the priority, right? A lot of people think it would be a good idea to teach the Bible in classrooms for reasons notwithstanding the Constitution, right? So I just want to get your thoughts on that and how, maybe perhaps you've seen journalists navigate that well or not.
So, I personally am appalled when a public official says something that's not true or says something contrary to what they said the year before. In 2016, Mitch McConnell said, we don't confirm Supreme Court justices in an election year, which was a bald lie. And then in 2020, when there was a vacancy on the Supreme Court, let's rush her through. And so I have to ask myself, and yet people who tell lies get elected and reelected over and over again. And I have to ask myself, well, to what extent do the voters care? Are they just assuming that all politicians lie? And I'll vote for them anyway because I like their policies. And I think that's where, frankly, and I regret to say this, I think that's where a lot of the American public is. And reporters, like lawyers, spend a lot of time tracking down all the different ways in which the witness contradicted himself. And we spend a lot of time doing that. This is what J.D. Vance said in 2024. This is what he said in 2022. This is what he said in a private email conversation in 2021, which is completely different from where he is now. This is what he said about Donald Trump in 2021, 2016, and now he's flipped. And you have to ask yourself, well, to what extent do the voters care? And so maybe I'm coming out the way you are. It's more important to report what they do, not so much what they say, and how effective they are at delivering for the voters, and how effective they are at keeping their promises.
Basically, so there's also things that elected officials don't say and then act upon, right? And so, for example, our governor, Governor Kevin Stitt, ordered one of our state agencies, the OMES, Oklahoma Management Enterprise Services, to conduct a sweeping analysis of cyber security vulnerabilities within all of our state assets and how they might be compromised by China or other foreign actors.
Yes.
And that was an executive order. Our state agency is doing that using taxpayer dollars for that. And there was one thing about it, and it was his press release. And I wrote about it on a Friday evening at 6 p.m. Third most read story on our site. I've been there for 3 weeks. And so that got me thinking, like, what the heck? Like, do people care about China? Do they care about doing something, anything? So,
well, you have to ask yourself, why was that press statement put out on a Friday afternoon? I mean, everybody here knows that the information that an administration, a governor or White House wants to put out that they don't want to put out, but they know they have to, comes out on Friday afternoons, right?
what I'm getting at is, like, to what degree is, and this is kind of getting into another realm here, but like, to what degree is that a concern that states would be compromised in a way? Because his whole pitch was like, in the case of an Indo-Pacific conflict, we have to do this. We're going to spend taxpayer dollars on it, and everybody's kind of like gung-ho. So, to what degree should we be worried about that? Was that story something that I should go follow up on and make sure that they're doing it for a reason and not spending taxpayer money on it?
So I think if the question is, to what extent should a state government worry about a foreign government infiltrating its systems? I think that's a good question to put to CISA, the Cybersecurity and Information and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is part of DHS, for what they would say about that. Get an intelligent cybersecurity expert from CISA on the record for a story. When did this statement come out, by the way?
A month or two ago?
All right, so it's still news.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a reason why it came out the way it did. It's like somebody wanted to do this, and the governor or somebody didn't really want to do it, or didn't give it a high priority, didn't want it to interfere with some other piece of news. There's probably some reason why it was the scope of this was limited to foreign governments. What about bad actors domestically?
Thank you for your questions. I apologize we couldn't get to everyone. I wanted to thank the Secretary for coming, for his remarks, for his answers to your questions, and just thank you very much.
Thank you.